It's time now for the Success is Subjective podcast. Here is your host and therapeutic consultant for young adults only, Joanna Lilley.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I know the anxiety that comes with watching a loved one struggle with a nonlinear path. This podcast was created to fight back against the narrow picture of success painted by social media. Each week we share authentic stories from people who changed course, maybe failed, and ultimately found their own definition of success. These are the stories you need to hear to prove that changing your mind is common and you don't have to have it all figured out at 18. If you're a parent or you're a young adult looking for a little proof, you're home. Now let's get into today's episode. And if you'd like to explore how I can help your young adult, you can schedule a free consultation through my website link in the show notes. Today, my guest is Annie Tulkin. Annie is the CEO and founder of Accessible College, as well as an author and public speaker. She is an expert in the area of college preparation and transition for students with physical disabilities and health conditions. She supports students and families across the country. Annie was the associate director of the Academic Resource Center at Georgetown University for nearly 6 years. In that position, she supported undergraduate, graduate, and medical students with physical disabilities and health conditions and oversaw academic support services for the entire student body. She holds a bachelor's degree in secondary education from DePaul University, a master's in special education from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a certificate in health coaching from Georgetown University. Annie was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mongolia from 2003 to 2005, and a Fulbright Fellow also in Mongolia from 2007 to 2008. She resides in Silver Spring, Maryland with her husband and her daughter. Let's not wait any longer. The anticipation is absolutely killing me. Here's Annie. All right, Annie, I'm excited to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'm excited. I feel like I have known about you forever through Adrian, but we've never really had pretty much any interaction or very limited interaction. So I'm just really excited to have you as a guest and to learn about you and to allow other people to get to know you that kind of follow my podcast. So why don't you tell us, we're just going to dive right in. Why don't you tell us, where did you grow up and what was the messaging that you were getting about what you're supposed to do after high school?
Okay. So that's a great starting question. I grew up on the north side of Chicago, which everyone will now hear in my accent. So both of my parents were guidance counselors. That's what we used to call them back in the day. Now we call them school counselors, but both of my parents are guidance counselors. My dad was a career counselor at community college. My mom was in middle schools and high schools, private and public schools across Chicago. And so both of my parents said, we don't really care what job you get in the future, but what you go to college for should be something that you can actually get a job in. And so I took an education path, and I had been a camp counselor in the summers and had some jobs related to just working with, young people. And so I decided to study secondary education in the college setting. And so that sort of led me into this space of supporting students with physical disabilities and chronic health conditions and sensory impairments as they are transitioning to college or thinking about college. And part of my personal experience, too, is I was also diagnosed with a learning disability in 5th grade. I'm grateful that I had the parents that I had because they noticed that things weren't really adding up, especially in math. See what I did there? So they were like, this doesn't seem, it seems like she's really struggling with these concepts. And so, they had the wherewithal to get me evaluated and get me tested. And sure enough, it was some of the processing pieces that were just not clicking for me. And so that experience also really informs my practice as well of being a now person who is in their 40s, who was diagnosed with a learning disability as a kid. And I also now have some chronic health conditions that have emerged in adulthood too. So that also informs my practice in working with students and families as well.
Yeah. All right. So let me ask like the backup to all of this too. So you get in college, you get a degree in like secondary education. Were you, I mean, obviously the field that you're in is still education as a like bridge, right? That's where you're at. From college to where you are now, where did that, or how did the journey lead you to what it is that you're doing now? Because I'm a woman in my 40s too. And I'm like, there's a lot that goes on between 21 and like, sometime in your 40s. So I'm just kind of curious, like where your employment path led you or kind of how it led you to what it is that you're doing now. Because let me also put a pin in that too and say what you're doing is also like in line a lot with what your parents were doing too. So there's got to be a familial connection there as well.
It's in the genes.
It's in the genes.
Yeah. So to be totally transparent, my parents instilled a great work ethic in all of us. I'm one of 4 in my family. I'm the youngest. So we all had jobs growing up. My dad started a lawn care business for us when we were on summer breaks. And my dad was a 9-month community college employee. So he also used this to save some money for us. He was also a day camp supervisor in the summers too. So he had a couple side hustles, which in this day and age is quite common. Back then was not really in the 80s and 90s. But so we always had jobs. I worked at the Warner Brothers store. I worked at a record store. In college, I worked at checking people in the dorms, swiping their cards in at DePaul University, where I went to school in Chicago. So that was working employment was a big part of our family. That was an expectation that they had, that we would have our own spending money and we would, take care of ourselves. But from the institutional path of like getting a degree in secondary education, I would say that I tried for most of my 20s to not have a job. So I was a Peace Corps volunteer right out of college. So I went to Mongolia and served in the Peace Corps for 2 years, where I worked with Mongolian teachers in Eastern Mongolia. They had all taught themselves English from books. They were told one day that they were English teachers. They had previously been Russian teachers. And so they had great grammar, but they did not really know how to like speak English the way that people speak it. And they didn't have a lot of like teaching pedagogy. So we worked on some of those things. So for 2 years, I lived in far Eastern Mongolia on the steppe and had that experience, which I absolutely loved. And Peace Corps volunteers say this a lot, but I learned more from them than they learned from me. And it was such a great experience that, I thought I'm going to go into international work, right? So after I finished Peace Corps, I said, how can I, again, not have a job? So I applied for graduate school while I was in Peace Corps, and I got into the University of Wisconsin-Madison to study special education, because one of the things that I observed when I was in Peace Corps was that there were lots of students that I was seeing who had different types of disabilities. And I was interested in sort of international accessibility and disability work. So I got a master's degree in special ed. And in part of that process, I thought to myself, how can I continue to not have a real job? So I got a Fulbright. And I went back to Mongolia and did research in Mongolia for a year on Mongolian teachers' perceptions of disability in the classroom. And so that experience was really illuminating too, and sort of solidified for me. I thought, okay, I'm going to do international disability and accessibility work. This is going to set me up for that work. But ultimately, I came back to the States and I had to find a job. I lived with my parents. I was in my mid-20s. I worked at a Montessori preschool on the north side of Chicago for a while. And I was just applying for jobs like mad. And at that point, it was 2008, 2009. It was like a tricky time for employment, although I feel like people say that all the time, but it was a tricky time. And I ultimately got a job at a nonprofit called the Association of University Centers on Disabilities. It's in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I live now, just outside Washington, D.C. And the association supports all the university centers on excellence in developmental disabilities. So there's almost one in every state and territory. And I was doing grants management and oversight. And so I came to DC for a job, and I've stayed in the DC area now for many, many years, since 2009. So that job for me sort of showed me that I wasn't great at working in an office and doing grants management. I learned a lot, but I missed working with students. So the job that really informs the work that I do now is I spent about 6 years as the associate director of the Disability Support Office at Georgetown University. So at Georgetown, that office is called the Academic Resource Center. So I was the associate director of the Academic Resource Center, working primarily with students with physical disabilities and health conditions, undergraduate, graduate, and medical school students, because at that time, one person oversaw all of those sort of domains in the university, and I did all of the housing accommodations, and I did academic support for the general student body, and I loved it. And I think part of it, too, was I had a really great boss who was also a Peace Corps volunteer. She had been in Thailand in the 80s, and we often joked, like, if you could do Peace Corps, you could do this job of being in student affairs, drinking from a fire hose, and that is true. I mean, a lot of student affairs workers, if anybody's listening, this is, like, it's a lot of work when you're working with students on a college campus, and many of these offices are really understaffed and under-resourced. And so, it can be a lot, but I loved that time. And it was actually during that time where I realized that there were so many students who had chronic health conditions like migraine disorders, autoimmune disorders, POTS, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and students even with physical disabilities, students who had spinal cord injuries or muscular dystrophy. They were really underprepared for coming to college and for the process of requesting accommodations and thinking about their needs holistically. So thinking about what would independent living look like for me, or how will I get my medicines, or if I need personal care support, what does that look like? And so I thought to myself, wow, someone should really be providing this support before students get to college. And then I made myself that person. So I started a business, right? I started Accessible College, and I first started it as a side hustle, and then I made it my full-time job prior to the pandemic. So that's six plus years now, almost 7 years of doing this full time. And I love it. I work with students across the country. I work with students with all types of physical disabilities, chronic health conditions, sensory impairments, blindness, visual impairments, hearing impairments, and deafness. And quite frankly, most of my students have co-occurring conditions. So like a learning disability and a physical disability, or a chronic health condition and a mental health condition. So I get to do this job now full time, and it's great.
Well, and we'll make sure that we have the links in the show notes for anybody that is listening that's like, I need to connect with Annie, which is a lot of people that are listening to my podcast. Let's just be real. So, loaded question is, now that you've kind of shared your story up to this point, do you see yourself as successful?
Yes. And yes. And I think, there's always room to grow, right? Like from this, I wouldn't say that I have a business mindset or an entrepreneurial mindset, but I've had to learn that. That's something I've really had to lean into. And so I think your measurements for success might shift as you're moving along, right? And so I know mine have shifted. After I left that job at Georgetown, I actually took another job doing ADA compliance, Americans with Disabilities Act compliance, as a contractor for the Department of Labor for the Job Corps program. And Job Corps is a national vocational training program for low-income youth, 18 to 25. And I used to go and do compliance. So I would go to these Job Corps centers and nobody wanted to see me because when you're the compliance person, like nobody loves it when you knock on their door. And like one of the things that, I learned there was that like, that really wasn't for me. I didn't love being the compliance person. But it gave me a sense of sort of greater applicability of the work that I do, right? So thinking about disabilities in the employment setting as well. But the measures of success have really changed. So when I started Accessible College, I was like, okay, it's, thinking about like, how can I reach certain populations of students? And now I'm thinking about other things, right? I'm moving on to thinking about like how I can optimize my programming, what online courses that I'm providing and how I can reach more people. And so that shifts. I try to set goals for myself every year. Sometimes I meet them, sometimes I don't.
Sometimes they need to be adjusted mid-year. It happens.
Yeah. But, I'm in a very niche position, right? So I'm the only person who provides this sort of targeted support for students with physical disabilities and health conditions. And so that is a selling point. It makes me unique. And, and I love what I do. So that's helpful as well.
Yeah. Well, and it's obvious to me, like, as you're talking to, like, clearly the journey and experiences leading to what you've been doing for the last 6+ years. It's like, it's evident that it's the calling, right? And I love that you said, like, did I know how to run a business? Nope. But am I learning? Absolutely. Right. Because that actually resonates with my story. Like, I don't know why you don't have to have an MBA to own a business, but you do have to understand how to run a business. But if you have a business where the content itself is like, you are an expert and there is space and there is want and need, like, that business can thrive, right? The business side of the business can be handled. So Let me ask this question, because it feels a little bit, I often in the work that I do just for context, I work with a lot of young adults where I end up kind of intersecting them after they have attempted college. Maybe they were there for a week, maybe they were there for 3 semesters. Oftentimes they're leaving because of poor academic performance, which we know is not always related to academic performance. It just is how it shows up on paper. But now we're kind of going back to the drawing board. And oftentimes the long-term goal is return to higher ed, whether it's return to the same institution, usually not the case. But I'm getting to the point of a lot of what I uncover when I'm meeting with these students is they might have had accommodations even in high school. They might have had a lot of support, and then all of a sudden they went off to school and either opted not to advocate for themselves for a lot of services, or maybe they got set up with them but ended up not following through, and subsequently things fell through the crack. So knowing that story, and then I just want to kind of hear your own context, like, what types of stuff do you tend to end up commonly navigating in conversation with students as we're talking about the like supports on campus, like how they tap into that and advocating for themselves? That was a monstrous story and kind of ambiguous question, but I'm just kind of curious, like, where that takes you.
Yeah, well, starting at the beginning, like statistically, we know that students with disabilities, about 21% of college students report having a disability. At any one college, somewhere between 10 and 20% of those students are actually going through the process of requesting accommodations, which requires students to go to the disability support office, provide documentation, have a meeting, get approved for accommodations. But I think the thing that gets lost in those stats is like, that's a huge portion of students on any given college campus. So that means that students with disabilities are the most prominent marginalized population on any campus. So there's a lot of students who have disabilities, whether they're visible or invisible, they are there. So period, mic drop. So there's also a huge drop off in students who receive accommodations from the K through 12 setting into college. And a further drop off when students go to graduate school, or if they're going to medical school or law school. These are just like sort of the stats as they exist today. So some of the questions around like, well, why does that happen, right? And I think like some of it is stigma. Some of it's not really understanding the transition process from high school to college because information is so varied. And sometimes, school counselors have huge caseloads and aren't spending a lot of time, and students aren't really investigating it, or they think, oh, it'll be different in college, so I just won't need accommodations. With the work that I do with my clients, I always tell clients, like, look, like you may not need accommodations, but they're not retroactive. So you want to set them up now before you go to college so that you have them in place. And it's like insurance. If you don't ever need it and you never have to use it, it's fine. At least you have it. But we need to make sure that we have all these systems set up and in place so that you can utilize those accommodations if you need them. And accommodations, because people sometimes think like, oh, it's just for the classes, just academic accommodations. For the students I work with, we think about accommodations holistically. So academic, dining, housing, transportation, programmatic accommodations, recreational accommodations. So thinking about all of their needs, all the things that come with living on a college campus, because it's not just going to class, right? That's a piece of it. And that might be a big piece of it, depending on who you are. Mm. But there are other aspects and there are other things that might need accommodating. And so, for example, if a student also had celiac disease or a food allergy, it's going to be really important to look at the dining accommodations and the process for requesting accommodations. Or if a student has Crohn's disease and they need easy access to a bathroom, or if they're doing infusions because they have POTS or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, we need to think about like, where's that taking place? How is that happening? And so that's where the housing accommodations might be an important piece of the puzzle too. So when I'm working with students, we think about what are the accommodations that we're going to need based on the students' needs, on their functional limitations, because the ADA talks about functional limitations of a student. So how the condition or conditions impact the student, and thinking about what those accommodations might be. And then from that, we can create a list of accommodations, and that's what we do together. And then thinking about the questions that they might want to ask as they are investigating schools and thinking about the types of colleges they want to attend, but talking directly to the disability support offices about the types of accommodations that they might be eligible for, should they choose to go there, and doing a vibe check with those disability support offices to see, like, is this a good fit for me? Are these people going to be supportive? I often joke that, you've seen one disability support office, you've seen one disability support office. They are all different. They all operate different. The mission, the values, the care, it's different from school to school. So it's really important that students and families are sort of investigating and thinking about that, because when you're going to college, you're buying a product. You might be spending upwards of $100,000 on something. So you want to make sure that the school is going to be a good fit for you, for the student. And it's an important piece of that investigative journey. So usually we create questions for disability support offices. I support students in evaluating those schools, looking at other pieces. There might be other medical needs that the student has. And then going through the process of thinking, okay, now that we have this information, how do we evaluate it? Once they get into school, it doesn't just end there. Once the student commits, they actually have to go through the process of requesting accommodations. So I help students create documentation that they can use with their doctor's offices, because doctor's offices don't always know about housing accommodations in college or, like the specific things around that. And then requesting the accommodations, the self-advocacy skills, and then figuring out the medication management and all of these pieces. So the work that I do is really akin to coaching. I spend a lot of time with students sort of figuring out, like, how are we going to implement these strategies? What are the next steps that we need to take? And how do we put you, the student, in the best position so that you can be successful in college?
Well, and I feel like that is a fantastic point to end on, because if somebody listening to this was like on the fence about working with you with their student, I'm pretty sure that the answer that you just gave absolutely sold the expertise and the knowledge that you have, and also probably cracked wide open, if they're not aware, how many steps to this process for a successful college experience, like how many touch points, how many resources and area of supports, and every day, every semester, navigating how things need to look differently to ensure collective success. And I love how you really differentiated it by saying it's not just academics, it's everything else. And oftentimes we don't think about it. So Annie, thank you for being a guest on the podcast. Thank you for the work that you're doing, for being the super cool human that you are, because that's obvious. In it, it's coming through loud and clear too. And I will make sure we have the link in the show notes for anybody to reach out to you. But I can't say it enough, as a call to action. If you are remotely interested in connecting with Annie, do it now.
Thanks, Joanna. I appreciate that.
That's it for this week's Success is Subjective episode. We want to thank our guest for joining Joanna on the show this week and for being willing to share your journey. This podcast would not exist if it weren't for people such as yourself. Stay tuned for our next episode, where you can bet it'll be another amazing human sharing their personal story with the world. Make sure you check out the show notes, where you will find contact information, website details, and all social media for our guest. If you're interested in being a guest on the podcast, you can email joanna@lilleyconsulting.com. Be sure to check out the lilleyconsulting.com website for additional resources outside of podcasting. Now, if you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe. And while you're at it, feel free to leave a review. You can also download to listen to the Success is Subjective podcast on other popular podcast apps, such as Audible, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. Thanks again for listening in, and remember, there is no single path through life. Success is what you make it.